a $2 billion catastrophe from a lake that wasn't supposed to exist. In the spring of 2023, it drowned an empire. An ocean of water appeared in the middle of California's agricultural heartland, swallowing mile after mile of cotton fields, tomato rows, and pistachio orchards. This was Tulare Lake, a body of water that had been erased from maps for a century, declared dead and buried under one of the most productive farm belts on Earth. And now, it was back. Its return was not gentle. It was violent. A ghost rising from a shallow grave to reclaim its territory. For the farmers who had built their fortunes on its dry bed, it was an unnatural disaster. A balance sheet apocalypse. For the indigenous Tachi-Yokut tribe, who had lived on its shores for millennia, it was a miracle. The return of a sacred ancestor they called Pa'ashi, a name that means big water. The lake was not a flood. It was a memory. The land remembering what it used to be. And the multi-billion-dollar agricultural machine that had tried to make it forget was now drowning in the consequences. By the time it peaked, the ghost lake spanned more than 114,000 acres. By the time it vanished again, just 2 years later, it had changed everything. The question is not whether the lake will return. The question is what happens when it does. To understand how a lake can simply reappear, you have to understand that it was never truly gone. It was just waiting. The San Joaquin Valley is a geological bowl, an endorheic basin, meaning it has no natural drain to the sea. For thousands of years, 4 rivers, the Kings, the Kaweah, the Tule, and the Kern, flowed down from the Sierra Nevada mountains, carrying the winter snowmelt, and pooled in the valley's lowest point. They created Tulare Lake. At its peak, it was the largest body of freshwater west of the Mississippi River, a vast inland sea covering up to 690 square miles, an ecosystem teeming with fish, birds, and life that supported tens of thousands of Yokuts people. It was the valley's natural state. It was not an interruption. It was the system itself. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new kind of settler arrived. Land barons with engineering degrees and an insatiable appetite for profit. Men like J.G. Boswell, who saw a vast, shallow lake and did not see an ecosystem. They saw an obstacle. They saw acres of unbelievably fertile soil, wasted, sitting just beneath the water's surface. So they began a war against the water itself. Systematically, relentlessly, they dammed the 4 rivers. They built levees, canals, and diversions. They choked off the lake's lifeblood, diverting every drop of Sierra snowmelt to irrigate the land they were claiming. Without its inflows, the Great Lake had nowhere to go but up. Under the brutal sun of the Central Valley, it evaporated. By the 1920s, it was gone, replaced by a grid of farm fields producing cotton and tomatoes for a global market. An agricultural empire built atop a liquid grave. The J.G. Boswell Company became one of the largest, most secretive, and most powerful farming operations in the world, its wealth and influence rooted directly in the soil of the dead lake. For a century, it worked. The ghosts slept. The farms thrived. The profits were unimaginable. But the lake never forgot. The system that created it was dormant, not destroyed. Every few decades, when nature delivered an unusually wet winter, the ghost would stir. In 1969, it came back. In 1983, it came back. In 1997, it came back. Each time, the rivers, swollen with snowmelt, would overwhelm the dams and diversions built to tame them. The water would spill out, and guided by a memory older than any human map, it would find its way back home, flooding the very fields that had replaced it. These were warnings. Geological tremors reminding the valley that its agricultural reality was a temporary arrangement, a century-long experiment conducted on borrowed land. Then came the winter of 2023. What arrived was not a tremor, it was an earthquake. The science behind the lake's return is simple and brutal. A series of intense atmospheric rivers, storms carrying tropical moisture across the Pacific, slammed into California one after another. They dumped record amounts of rain on the valleys and feet upon feet of snow in the mountains. By April 3, 2023, the California Department of Water Resources made a stunning announcement. The Sierra Nevada snowpack, the frozen reservoir that feeds the state's rivers, was at 237% of its average. 2 winters' worth of water, waiting in the mountains, ready to melt. There was nowhere for it to go. The dams and canals designed to control the 4 rivers were engineered for normal years, for manageable flows. They were not built for this. As spring temperatures climbed, the melt began. A torrent of water cascaded down from the mountains. The Kings, Kaweah, Tule, and Kern rivers swelled beyond their banks, broke through levees, and began their ancient journey back to the valley floor. The water flowed south, seeking the lowest point in the basin. It was seeking home. It was seeking Tulare. On the shores of the re-emerging lake, as billions of dollars of crops disappeared beneath the rising water, Leo Cisco stood and watched. He is the chairman of the Santa Rosa Rancheria Tachi Yokut tribe. For his people, this was not a disaster. It was a prophecy fulfilled. "I am very happy the lake is back," he told reporters, his voice thick with emotion. "It makes me swell with pride to know that in this lifetime I get to experience it, the stories that we heard when we were kids. For us, it comes to fruition." While agricultural giants panicked, the Tachi Yokut sang. They held ceremonies. For the first time in generations, they saw Pa'ashi, their great water, breathing again. It was a spiritual homecoming, a validation of an ancestral memory that the modern world had tried to erase. The return of the lake was a story told in 2 languages, the language of loss, spoken in dollars and crop yields, and the language of rebirth, spoken in songs and prayers on a shoreline that hadn't existed a few months before. For the agricultural empire, the language was purely financial, and the numbers were staggering. Kings County officials projected that 41% of the county's $2.43 billion crop value would be wiped out. Another $1 billion in infrastructure, roads, canals, buildings was projected to be damaged or destroyed. A localized loss of over $2 billion, all because a lake that was supposed to be dead refused to stay that way. It was a direct consequence of a decision made 100 years earlier. But here's the part they never saw coming. The choices made to keep the lake dead had in fact made its return infinitely more dangerous. This was the Tulare Lake Paradox, a trap engineered by the very people it was now consuming. The paradox is a story of sinking ground. To farm the dry lake bed, you need water. With the rivers diverted, that water had to come from somewhere. For decades, the massive agricultural operations pumped it from deep underground. Year after year, decade after decade, they drilled wells and pulled trillions of gallons of water from the aquifers beneath the lake bed. They were draining the earth from below to keep it dry on top. The consequence of this massive, sustained pumping is a phenomenon called subsidence. When you remove that much water from the porous layers of clay and sediment underground, the land itself begins to compact. It compresses. It sinks. The ground level physically drops, and in the Tulare Lake Basin, it has been sinking at a terrifying rate. Around the city of Corcoran, on the edge of the historic lake bed, the ground has dropped by as much as a foot per year in some places. What the farmers had inadvertently done was make the bowl deeper. By trying to cheat nature, they had deepened the grave, engineering the perfect container for their own destruction. It was not a possibility. It was a certainty. As independent researcher Deirdre Desjardins famously put it, Tulare Lake is playing Russian roulette with flooding, and they just lost. Nowhere was this paradox more visible, more terrifying, than at the city of Corcoran. Corcoran is a city of about 22,000 people, including the populations of 2 state prisons, sitting right on the rim of the ancient lake. It is protected by a single, critical earthen levee. In 2017, that levee was built up to a height of 195 feet above sea level. It was considered safe. But between 2017 and 2023, while the levee stayed put, the ground underneath it sank. The massive groundwater pumping by the surrounding agribusinesses, primarily the J.G. Boswell Company, had pulled the floor out from under the city's only defense. By the time the 2023 floodwaters were rushing towards it, the levee's effective height was just 188 feet. It had lost 7 feet of protection. It was sinking faster than it could be reinforced. As the resurrected lake grew, a frantic, desperate effort began. Bulldozers and construction crews worked around the clock, piling dirt on top of the sinking levee, trying to outrun the rising water. The cost to taxpayers for this emergency fix, bailing out a city whose defenses were compromised by private industry, between $17 and $20 million. It was a microcosm of the entire disaster, a community held hostage by the consequences of an agricultural system that privatized profits while socializing the risks. But the danger wasn't just in Corcoran. A few miles away, the floodwaters threatened a small, historic community called Allensworth. Founded in 1908, it's one of the few towns in America established and governed exclusively by African Americans. It sits on the edge of the lake bed, low-lying and deeply vulnerable. For residents there, the rising water felt like a threat aimed directly at their history and their homes. The fight to save towns like Allensworth became a chaotic, desperate game of hydraulic chess, and it revealed the brutal power dynamics of the valley. Jack Mitchell, the manager of a local water district, found himself in a surreal battle not just against the water, but against corporate interests. As water levels surged, districts had to make horrifying choices about where to send the overflow. Mitchell's anemic district was trying to protect small communities. But according to reports from local journalists at SJV Water, their efforts were sabotaged. The J.G. Boswell Company, the valley's dominant power, allegedly parked giant bulldozers on canal banks. They physically blocked smaller districts from opening relief gates. The move protected Boswell's own high-value tomato crops. But it allegedly redirected the destructive floodwaters toward its neighbors, toward smaller farms and toward vulnerable towns like Allensworth. Boswell's executives have denied the accusations, calling it lazy reporting and claiming they were just following historical flood protocols. But for men like Jack Mitchell on the ground, it felt like being checkmated by a king. It was a game of flood control whack-a-mole, where the player with the most bulldozers and the most expensive crops got to decide who drowned. The state's Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, and Governor Newsom's office were forced to intervene, authorizing emergency levee cuts and funding last-ditch efforts to steer the water. But the core conflict was laid bare. When the water returns, not all land is equal. The fight for survival wasn't just about levees and sandbags. It was about wealth, power, and the historical right to decide whose land was worth saving. The empire that had killed the lake was now, in its own moment of crisis, willing to sacrifice its neighbors to save itself. Then, almost as quickly as it arrived, the ghost began to retreat. By the summer of 2024, the lake was visibly shrinking. The same force that had erased it a century ago went back to work. The relentless Central Valley sun. The basin has no outlet. The only way for the water to leave is to evaporate. In the extreme heat, it did so with shocking speed. A lake that had covered 114,000 acres was, within a year, a collection of shrinking pools and muddy flats. On June 4, 2024, NASA's MODIS satellite confirmed what everyone on the ground could see. Tulare Lake had essentially vanished. Again, farmers, incredibly, began moving back in, plowing the muddy, newly enriched soil, ready to plant again. It seemed like the crisis was over, a freak event, a devastating but temporary interruption. Back to business. Not an historic reckoning. Just a very, very wet year. But it wasn't over. The lake was gone, but the damage was done. And this time, a line had been crossed. The sheer scale of the destruction, the sinking land, the emergency taxpayer bailouts, it had caught the attention of Sacramento. The state of California was no longer willing to let the region police itself. The 2023 flood had exposed the catastrophic failure of the local water agencies, many of which, like the El Rico Groundwater Sustainability Agency, were overwhelmingly controlled by the very same corporate farms, like Boswell, causing the subsidence. Their proposed plans to manage groundwater had controversially allowed for the land to keep sinking. The state saw this as an abdication of responsibility. The game was over. On April 16, 2024, the California State Water Resources Control Board took an unprecedented step. It officially placed the entire Tulare Lake subbasin on probationary status under a powerful state law, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or GMA. For the first time, the state was seizing direct control. It was a declaration of war against the century-old power structure of the valley. The agricultural giants did not take it lying down. The Kings County Farm Bureau immediately sued the state, arguing that the probation was an illegal overreach. They won a temporary injunction in mid-2024, a brief victory that paused the state's crackdown. The legal battle raged for over a year, a high-stakes fight between corporate agriculture and government regulators. But in December of 2025, an appeals court delivered the final verdict. It reversed the injunction. The state had won. The probation was back on, and with it came a reckoning that had been a century in the making. The state moved fast. As of 2026, the old way of doing business in the Tulare Lake Basin is over. It is finished. For the first time in history, the big agricultural operators are being forced to account for the water they pump. A hard deadline was set. May 1st, 2026. By that date, every single farmer in the Basin was legally required to install meters on their wells, submit exact reports of their groundwater extraction to the state through a new system called GEARS, and start paying for what they used. The fees were not symbolic. $300 per well just to register, and then a fee of $20 for every acre-foot of water pumped from the ground. An acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons. The very resource they had exploited for free to build their empire now came with a price tag. It was a fundamental shift in power, not a request, a mandate. The Ghost Lake, in its 2-year return, had accomplished what decades of activism and scientific warnings could not. It had forced the government's hand. It had put a meter on the machine that killed it. So where does that leave the valley today, in July of 2026? The fields are dry. The tractors are running. Cotton and tomatoes are growing again on the lake bed. From a satellite, it looks almost as if 2023 never happened. But on the ground, everything has changed. The agricultural giants are farming under a new reality, one of oversight, metering, and fees. They are paying for the sin of subsidence. But the fundamental problem remains. They are still farming in a lake that has proven, time and again, that it will return. Dr. Vivian Underhill, a researcher from Northeastern University, captured the truth of the situation perfectly. This landscape has always been one of lakes and wetlands, she stated, and our current irrigated agriculture is just a century-long blip in this larger geologic history. This was not actually a flood. This is a lake returning. It is a profound and unsettling idea that the farms, the towns, the entire economy of the region is not the permanent state of affairs. It is the aberration. The lake is the norm. And the climate models suggest that the conditions that brought it back are becoming more, not less, common. The atmospheric rivers are getting warmer, wetter, and more intense. The wild swings between extreme drought and extreme deluge, what climatologists call weather whiplash, are the new reality for California. Another 237% snowpack year isn't a matter of if, it is a matter of when. When it comes, will the new rules be enough? Will the meters and the fees force enough conservation to matter? Or will it just add a new line item to the cost of doing business, a cost passed on to consumers, while the land continues to sink and the risk continues to build? The state crackdown is a reaction to the last disaster. It is not necessarily a solution to the next one. The fundamental conflict has not been resolved. A multi-billion-dollar industry is occupying land that belongs to a body of water, a ghost with a powerful memory and an endless supply of patience. The story of Tulare Lake is not about a natural disaster. It is about a human one. A story of ambition, engineering, and the stunning arrogance of believing that nature can be permanently conquered. For a century, it looked like the engineers had won. They built an empire on a dry lake bed, a testament to human ingenuity. But the return of the lake in 2023 was a humbling, terrifying reminder. The lake bed is not just soil, it is a scar. And scars remember. Today, the water is gone again. The ghost has retreated into the earth. But its presence lingers. It is in the new water meters being installed on wells. It is in the legal briefs filed by frustrated farmers. It is in the memory of the Tachi Yokut people who for a brief, glorious moment saw their ancestor return. The empire is rebuilt. But it is weaker now. Watched, measured,